On behalf of the Friends of the Semel Institute, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's Open Mind presentation on preventing violence in our educational institutions. We are very honored to have with us this evening Dr. Park Dietz, who is one of the country's foremost experts in forensic psychiatry and has testified or consulted on almost every major criminal case in our recent history. Dr. Dietz is a MD, Master's in Public Health, and a PhD, which is quite an amazing credential, and we are very fortunate that he is here to speak with us this evening. So thank you, Dr. Dietz. And also with us this evening is Dr. Andrew Luchter, who is a professor of psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences here at UCLA. And he's also our faculty advisor, but he also was Dr. Dietz's former student. And Dr. Dietz has said that Dr. Luchter was the smartest student he ever had. So, Dr. Luchter, former student, will be introducing Dr. Dietz. And we're very fortunate and thank Dr. Luchter for being here with us this evening. I know that many of you have been with us before, but for those of you who are here for the first time, I just want to briefly tell you about the Semel Institute and the Friends. We are a volunteer organization. We support the Semel Institute, which is one of the premier centers for the study of the brain, mind, brain, and behavior in the world, with a faculty of over 400 clinicians and researchers who work collaboratively to develop new treatments for illnesses of the mind and brain. And the Friends focus our work in two areas, one being education, and we produce the Open Mind, the series which you're here for this evening. We bring renowned speakers to UCLA and present programs with preeminent professors of psychiatry from the Semel Institute, researchers from the Semel Institute about illnesses of the mind and brain and current research being done on them. We also believe very strongly in supporting the next generation of young scientists through our Friends Scholar Program and our Friends Travel Grant Program. Each year we award scholarships to brilliant young faculty, junior faculty or fellows to start their research. And this year we're very fortunate. One of our scholars, Erin Kelly, is doing work in community, in helping homeless people have better access to services for both mental and physical disorders. And Dr. Kelly is here with us this evening. Because of the generosity of our donors, we are able to fund 3 young scholars this year, and we are able to continue to bring you these incredible Open Mind programs that we hope that you will continue to attend and hopefully will support. And I see another one of our scholars coming in right now, Dr. Tara Paris. She is studying anxiety disorders in young people. So welcome, and thank you all for coming this evening. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Luchter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vicki. So I was a third-year medical student, and I really wanted to understand something more about criminal behavior and thought that a career in forensic psychiatry might be very interesting. So I started, this was pre-Google, of course, So just started reading in terms of, who was the world's foremost expert on criminal behavior, and who were the rising stars in this field. And of course, one of the names that came up was Dr. Park Dietz, who at that point was on the faculty at Harvard. So I arranged to go do an elective with Park. My first assignment there was to go to the Bridgewater State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, where I sat down across from this man. I wanted to get to know him, and I said, "So, what brings you here?" And he starts with this torrent of expletives about how he had to be the one to kill Jimmy Carter because Jimmy Carter had been seeing one of his 30 wives and had been using radio waves to control his brain. And I said, "Can you excuse me just 1 second?" And that's when I went and got Park. I think it is no exaggeration to say that I learned more about how to deal with deeply disturbed, frequently psychotic individuals from Park than I have from anybody else. He has seen and dealt with some extraordinarily disturbed individuals, many of whom are unfortunately involved in very violent or criminal acts. And I think it's no exaggeration to say that he is one of the world's foremost experts on the criminal mind. Park went on from being on the faculty at Harvard to being on the faculty at UVA, where he was the director of the University of Virginia Center for Psychiatry and the Law. From there, he actually moved out here and became a member of our clinical faculty and founded his own forensic practice, as well as Threat Assessment Group, which is an entity which is really focused on assessing threats and preventing violence in all sorts of settings, including in educational institutions. And I'm really thrilled that Park is here to speak with us about his work tonight. His list of accomplishments goes on and on. He is the former president of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law, one of the foremost forensic psychiatry organizations in the country. He's a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, has been a consultant to the FBI and to law enforcement in all 50 states, and has been involved in virtually every high-profile violent crime case, multiple murder case in the country in the latter part of the 20th century, including the Unabomber case, John Hinckley, Jeffrey Dahmer, the DC sniper, sort of the list goes on and on. And of course, his premier academic credential is he's a consultant to Law and Order. Which of course, there are so many shows, I'm surprised that doesn't take all of his time. So without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce to you my friend and mentor, Dr. Park Dietz.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy, for that very warm introduction. I'm going to try something unusual tonight. It's been recommended to me that rather than showing you PowerPoint all evening, that it could be of some interest to you if I were to actually talk to you. And I'm going to do that in a way that's not familiar to me particularly. I'm going to speak somewhat biographically about how I came to this and go from that to what I've learned in the course of it. Because what I get asked often is, how did I start all of this? And I'm going to tell you about that frankly. In 1960, when I was 12 years old, I met a boy named Tommy who ran a band. Now, Tommy was a kind of interesting, fascinating character for a 12-year-old. I became the drummer for the band. He was the first guy to sell switchblades in town. He was the first kid to have pornography and show it and sell it. He was the first kid to figure out how you steal beer off back porches and sell it to the other kids. And he was the coolest kid around the playground. He was a few years older. He got expelled from that school and many others. And I lost touch with him, was not allowed to play in the band anymore after the police told my parents he was running a prostitution ring. And I thought he was interviewing female vocalists. What did I know? And I lost touch with Tommy for 3 years, and I came back from a trip somewhere away and was speaking to a girl that I dated briefly and learned that she had been raped by Tommy. Years later, I would learn that Tommy became an alcoholic tugboat captain off Seattle and died of cirrhosis. And apparently never did any time for what I imagine is a long life of crime. Anyway, I think that's what got me interested in violence and sex crimes and prevention. So, moving ahead a few years, in 1969, I was thinking about going to grad school in criminology because I discovered that there was this field, not represented at Cornell, of criminology that sounded much more interesting than medicine, which my parents expected I would study because my grandfather and father and uncles all had. So I came to Berkeley to look at the criminology school, and just then Governor Reagan shut it down because it was the only way he could fire a tenured Marxist on the faculty. So he closed the school. And I didn't know there was any place else to study criminology and thought, oh no, what am I going to do now? I started applying to med schools. And just then I came across a book in the Cornell campus store called Forensic Medicine by Keith Simpson, which was a physician's book about crimes he'd participated in investigating, with photos of skeletons in a box and babies drowned in a toilet and men hanging while cross-dressed out in the woods with pornography scattered around them, and sexual homicides and ghastly mutilations. And I thought, all right, so physicians can get involved in crime solving. I'll do that. So I went to medical school and every step of the way thought, how can this be useful in solving a crime? Literally every course I found a way to connect it to crime solving. Microbiology was the hardest, but I found an article in the Egyptian Medical Journal in which a murder was solved by identifying which form of the parasite that causes malaria had been found at the scene and in the suspect. So everything became relevant to crime solving. In 1972, I got to interview my first murderer. And like anyone who's never talked to a murderer before, thought that was a pretty interesting phenomenon. Mostly they're boring people, it turns out. In med school, I did electives in forensic medicine and got an office at the medical examiner's office in Baltimore. I was at Hopkins. And the morgue is filled with tragedy. Every night, going out to scenes. I went out to the scenes with the deaners who pick up the bodies and prepare them to see what it was like at a death scene of people being shot or people being stabbed, hanged, and saw firsthand tragedy, but never got the whole backstory. It was a very superficial investigation. The police would then take it from there and do more. But it was pretty interesting that these things were happening. And I went around and knocked on every door in the medical examiner's office to see what people did there. And I met a woman named Susan Baker. Susan Baker did research on traffic fatalities, motorcycle crashes, transportation-related injuries, and was one of 3 pioneers in a field called injury control research that was effecting a paradigm shift from the idea that people get harmed by accident, acts of God, to people being harmed by physics, nature, things that might be controlled and prevented. So as I worked with her and did my first research on drowning, I thought, there are people who get injured by intentional acts of others. Maybe that ought to be looked at. Maybe we could prevent intentional injury. So I began gathering a lot of data, and I gathered foolish data like homicides related to the phases of the moon, which was a controversy in the literature at the time, because every psychiatric emergency room nurse will tell you, oh yes, the full moon makes a difference. I discovered in going through all the files there and doing little studies, a high prevalence of stabbing and blunt force trauma to pregnant women that had killed them. And it looked obvious that the injuries were to the abdomen. Years later, we now know that this is because domestic violence offenders will often increase their abuse when their spouses are pregnant, and pregnancy is one of the risk factors for the woman being killed. It looked to me as though there were lots of patterned tragedies stemming from human behavior. Now, that led me to get a master's degree in public health to understand how you analyze those patterns and what can be done with it. But really nothing was more profound to me than understanding that there was a way to look at health problems and injuries, including intentional injuries, that public health had long used for infectious disease. And that is to think of there being primary prevention where the potentially injurious act never occurs. Successful primary prevention, there is no infection, there is no injury. Secondary prevention, the injurious event or infection has occurred and you treat it. And most of medicine is secondary prevention. Tertiary prevention is the long-term rehabilitation after the fact. And what's crystal clear in the history of public health and medicine is that tertiary prevention is not entirely effective and is very, very expensive. Secondary prevention can be quite effective, but very expensive. And primary prevention, as a rule, is cheap and wonderful. Hence polio vaccine. Hence clean drinking water, hence vaccinations of all kinds, hence washing your hands. Primary prevention is where the action is in public health. So it seemed to me we should try to do the same thing for intentional injury in all settings. Well, just as I was thinking these thoughts, an outbreak occurred in Philadelphia of a disease that became known from that incident as Legionnaire's disease. This is 1976. I was a resident by that time at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and I thought, this seems to have been conveyed through the air ducts of the hotel. They're Legionnaires. Somebody might have done this intentionally. So I got on a plane and flew to the CDC in this foolish sophomoric effort to convince the CDC of two things. And I met with the director. The first was the CDC ought to work collaboratively with the FBI in investigating disease or injury outbreaks that might be intentional and have a criminal basis, because otherwise they would miss it and they would be using the wrong methods of investigation. They could proceed simultaneously. The other thing I sought to convince Bill Fahey, the director at the time, to do was to start a center for injury control at the CDC that, in addition to looking at traffic and transportation-related injuries, falls, and other serious sources of injury and disability, would look at intentional injury, rape, homicide, assault, suicide. He nearly kicked me out of his office as a lunatic. I was very disappointed, kind of crushed, as young kid enthusiastically on my own money, I earned, what, $12,000 a year at the time, flying there to try to change the world and being told I was an idiot. So I retreated and thought, well, I'll just try to write about this stuff. Published something on countermeasures for rape that was really the first publication on injury control for intentional injury. That's 77. And by 78, I was off to Harvard. Now, at Harvard, my very first day, my boss, Sher Fraser, said, go over to this local Fortune 500 company. They have a threatening employee. Do something about it. Well, there was nothing known about how you deal with threatening employees or how you analyze a threat. I stumbled my way through, and it all turned out okay. And I thought, this must happen often. How can someone develop a means of handling threats within a workplace? Well, my real job that I had to go to the next day was at this horrible institution, Bridgewater State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, that Andy mentioned to you. This was a classic snake pit. This was just a few years after an expose called Titicut Follies had been banned so that it couldn't be shown to anyone except eventually students under a consent decree of some kind. It's now on the internet, I'm told. But it showed horribly abusive practices in the treatment of the mentally ill. And they'd built a new hospital, but the practices hadn't changed. I was supposed to try to turn this into a Harvard teaching hospital. The best we actually did was to reduce the frequency of the staff beating the patients, which they routinely did under the name Irish therapy. Well, two things came out of that experience for me, besides the desire never to work in a bureaucracy of any kind ever again. One was that the stories of the patients were, every one of them, a tragedy, just like a Greek tragedy. I'd read a lot of Greek theater in high school from a great English teacher. And in Greek tragedy, the audience sees it coming, and then it happens. And that's exactly what was true of all these stories. A smart person hearing the story would see it coming. But these patients were surrounded by stupid people and bureaucrats and institutions that failed them every which way, so that though they were throwing out signals of distress and despair and rage, everyone was ignoring it. Their teachers, their parents, their neighbors, the local police, the social service agencies trying to respond, all had failed them. This seemed to me intolerable and horrible. I thought, well, I can't go address all that. I'm a low-level employee here and junior faculty. Maybe I can start small. How do we prevent injuries within the institution? So I did epidemiologic research looking at assaults and batteries in the institution and published a series of articles about it. And what I discovered of practical importance was that most injuries to staff and patients happened when they were doing what's called a takedown, where a patient is out of control, agitated, violent, threatening. The staff are required in some manner to subdue them. Now, there are lots of different ways to do that, but the way these thugs were doing it was to have 3 or 4 people go in and beat the patient down, and everyone was getting injured. So it was very clear from the data that by using the better, more modern, more humane techniques for subduing violent patients, they'd reduce not only patient injuries, which I knew these guys didn't care about, but staff injuries. And I thought, now I have a hook. Because they don't want to get injured, of course, they'll be receptive to something that reduces staff injuries. So I took it to the superintendent and proposed a plan that would provide greater safety to both patients and staff, and I emphasize the staff part. And I was pulled aside soon thereafter and told by the staff that if I pushed this any further, no one was going to come help me when patients attacked me, because what I was doing was hurting the staff. I said, "What are you talking about? I'm trying to keep the staff safe." They said, "No, doc, you don't understand. This is the only way we get paid time off. When we get an injury, we get to stay home, watch football, drink beer, and we get paid. We don't want you changing anything." Another lesson in bureaucracy and unionization and perverse incentives in the world. So I thought, okay, this isn't the place. Maybe I'll find a place that would like to reduce injury. Now, around that time in '79, I was recruited to go start doing some tasks with the FBI Academy, Behavioral Science Unit at Quantico. And that leads to a whole set of other stories that are the rest of the other side of my career. But among the things that they were interested in doing was figuring out how you analyze threatening communications. Because they had occasion to be asked about that. What do we do about this threatening communication? And then along came the assassination attempt on President Reagan by John Hinckley. I was asked to be in charge of the evaluation of him, and that put me on the national stage when I was 32, and really was a life-changing kind of opportunity. The upshot of it was that now I had credentials for looking at threats against public figures, which allowed me to get a grant to study threats and attacks against public figures from the National Institute of Justice, which I then studied, because I wanted to learn how you prevent threats and attacks on public figures. Now, the following year, in '82, in Chicago, there was an incident in which citizens consumed poisoned product, namely Tylenol. This was the second most publicized event in history after the Kennedy assassination. The Tylenol tampering incident was number 2. And through the FBI Academy, I was asked to participate in the investigation of it. I got very interested in this because it's an intentional epidemic, like the CDC had told me never happened. And I became the tampering guru on the behavior of tamperers. And that's what led into consulting to corporations about behavior. They would come to me when they had a threat arrive: if you don't give us money, we're going to tamper with your product. Or people saying, "I've already put cyanide in your toothpaste, in your baking soda, in your cosmetics," and so on. From 1982 to 1986, I spent a lot of time with the food, drug, and cosmetics industry, consulting on those cases and helping them decide how to investigate it, whether to withdraw product from the market, and so on. Because if they withdrew the product every time, it would have been a calamitous event for the economy. Because by 1986, there were 3,000 episodes a year. It was a major epidemic. The public didn't learn much about how often it was happening. Now, one of the things done there to interrupt the cycle of copycat crime, which clearly it was, the first event was the '82 incident. The only thing I've ever found that sounds like an earlier expression of the idea is one person told me that there was a Dick Tracy comic book with that storyline in it. I haven't found it yet. I did find an underground book offering cyanide for sale, but not the proposal to put it in capsules prior to '82. After '82, there were many books telling you how to put it in capsules. That's another story. I discovered in working with companies two important things. One was they didn't have internal behavioral expertise to manage really strange behavior, including violent behavior. Second, that the profit motive made them act rationally 100% of the time. They would do a calculation of what will it cost if we do, what will it cost if we don't, what is in the long-term interest, how do we handle this, which always led to deciding to do the right thing, at least with these companies. Because if you have your eye on the long term, you have to do the right thing. This was a shock because I'd been taught in my training not to trust corporations, they were evil. Actually, I've come to learn that corporations are moral, and more so than academics or bureaucrats or a host of other categories of people I was taught to trust. So this began to move me away from some of my previous ideas of the world and how it operated. Now, the thing about tampering that was most interesting was how the epidemic got interrupted. An organization based in LA that no longer exists, called the Foundation for American Communications, put together a series of conferences in '85 and '86 in which there were representatives of law enforcement, journalism, and industry, and a few topical experts like me who would speak at each of these conferences around the country. And the moderator would drive the audience through discussion to a consensus at the end of each conference. And a consensus reached at the end of each of these conferences was that to reduce the epidemic of copycat crimes known as tampering, what the press could do is to recode their stories so that instead of every one of these stories being national or international on the wires, they could be called regional or local if that's all that was affected. Journalists adopted this, kept the stories local where it was appropriate, and the epidemic vanished. Now, this was not the first time that had ever occurred. The editors of newspapers in Vienna, out of concern for an epidemic of suicide by people jumping in front of subway trains, had decided voluntarily not to put it above the fold on the front page, but to put the story elsewhere in the paper. Instantly, suicides dropped. And there are other examples around the world. This underlies the advice I began to give after the Edmonton, Oklahoma post office mass murder. I gave my first interview to the press advising while on the air to not have sensational coverage with sirens blaring, hysterical narration, biographical detail, and a big photo of the shooter running 24/7 for every mass murder. And the prediction I made was, if you keep this coverage up, you will have another mass murder within 2 weeks. Now, I've been on CNN 3 or 4 times saying that, BBC sometimes saying that, and every other network, and they don't listen. Mass murderers are suicidal, so of course it's going to be as copycatable as any other kind of suicide. If we want to turn it off, we have to stop promoting it. It's as simple as that with mass murder. Well, that was '86 that Edmonton happened. The year before that, the National Academy of Sciences had a committee on trauma research. I was on the committee, and the chair of it was Bill Fahey, the former director of the CDC. And guess what happened 9 years after my visit to the CDC? The committee, now with congressional support, decided to create an injury control center at the CDC. So something good came of that. From doing this work with corporations and seeing their need, I founded this company, Threat Assessment Group, in '87. I'd already been doing a fair amount of corporate consulting. I thought it ought to be made more systematic to prevent injuries in workplaces from people behaving in bad ways. So the things we were concerned about initially were violent behavior. How do you prevent violence in a manufacturing facility, in a university, in a school? And I had the good fortune of having 3M Company invite me to make them a laboratory for studying how to do this. They said, let's experiment. We'll try it one way. If that fails, we'll try another. Let's try till we get it right. Now, initially, we tried some things that were not good ideas. One bad idea was making it a mental health problem, that everyone who committed a violent act or made a threat or misbehaved terribly would be sent for a medical or mental health evaluation. That's what IBM had been doing after their 2 mass murders. Total failure. By medicalizing the problem, we sort of gave a preemptive insanity defense and took responsibility away from people who were behaving badly. Some people didn't want a medical evaluation. All sorts of problems arose from it. That's one example of a rapidly discarded approach. Another approach we tried was to make use of a tool that I developed while doing the Justice Department research, where we'd learned that you can predict certain behavior by entering a handful of variables, I think 20, into an algorithm based on data that we'd collected to predict whether new actors would behave in bad ways. Well, we had very accurate predictions. And we, for a time, made these accurate predictions to clients. Unfortunately, it dawned on us that this wasn't really helpful. How does it help a school administrator or a manager of a facility to know that the chances of this student or employee acting violently in the next 6 months are 72% or 17%? All they want to know is, how do we make it as close to 0% as possible? So we stopped assessing the threats in any quantitative way, and I was sorry I named my company Threat Assessment Group. Now, initially what we were doing was waiting till someone made a threat, devising a means of making sure threats got reported to the appropriate people, and once a threat got reported, we would then figure out what to do to keep people safe. Turns out that worked. We've now done over 5,000 serious threats, the worst you can imagine, and no one who took our advice ever got hurt, not once. There was one person who did the opposite of what we said. We told him, when the individual comes into your office for the meeting, you sit down, you offer them something to eat or drink, and you do not get within arm's reach. You do not approach them. Don't stand in their presence. Instead, what he did was get right in his face, put his chest up to the other guy's chest, yell at him, wag his finger at him, and he got pushed. He wasn't hurt, but he got pushed. That's a failure. But he didn't take our advice. The other one was far worse. It was a domestic violence victim whom we told every which way from Sunday, do not go back to your house until he's in custody and you confirm he's in custody. If you go back to your house, he will kill you. Do not go back to your house. She went back to her house and he killed her. I tell you the failures to illustrate that sometimes we're talking about very serious matters, and people who take the advice do very well. So we thought, this is great. If we get a threat, we can save the life. And we can. Then it dawned on us, 7 years into it, and I'm embarrassed it took that long, not a single one of these cases, not one ever, was a nice, good person in a nice, productive environment who suddenly, with no warning, made a threat. It never, ever starts with the threat. For potential violence within an institution, the threat is a very late stage notice given before violence. Now, it may not lead to violence, don't get me wrong there. But threats are very late stage expressions of frustration or weakness or a desire to change. They're never the beginning of the story. They're what happens when earlier signs of trouble are ignored and mismanaged. To get a threat within an organization by a member of that community, you have to negligently fail to manage several preceding steps. And if you negligently fail to manage the threat, you might get violence. But you can't make one mistake and get killed for it. Various people have to make a whole bunch of mistakes before it turns violent. Now, you won't always hear the truth about this from institutions describing how the violent act happened. You will hear it said that there was no motive, there was no warning, nobody knew anything. It's not true. What can be true is that no one in the institution knew much, and that the 3 or 4 people who knew something had never shared it with anyone else. We use a set of proprietary indicators of what we call signs of a troubled employee, the result of which is a referral to employee assistance or to mental health care or medical care. And we use another set of things we call indicators of troubling situations that are more related to violence, for which what occurs is a preliminary investigation by a team that collects data and decides what to do. Now, we use those to look at events that have already occurred. The fewest number of warnings we've ever seen for a homicide in a workplace was 2, and the 2 for that person included stalking. So, that in itself is serious misconduct. Generally, there are 10 to 30 risk factors present and known to the organization before a shooting occurs. Often a very long history of it. Now, when there's an investigation after a school shooting or a workplace shooting, which is more likely to be a thorough investigation if someone can be sued for many millions. If there's a dead shooter and nobody worth millions to sue, the investigation will be superficial. But if there are many millions to be gained, there will be a thorough investigation. I've been a part of many of these. And those thorough investigations interview everyone who knew the people involved. When that's done, inevitably, large numbers of sightings of very worrisome behaviors emerge. It's part of how we learned what the indicators are, is by looking retrospectively after bad things have happened. So by 1988, we already knew what the indicators were for this rare event of mass murder. I say rare event because mass murders that capture our attention and are in the news still only happen so often compared to rape, assault, bullying, sexual harassment, taunting, humiliation, verbal abuse. These happen every day in every institution, probably in most buildings of every institution, Some of them happen daily. If you look at the emotional costs, the psychological harms, and the actual calculable out-of-pocket economic costs, at least for profit-making enterprises, the mass murders are the least expensive because they're unlikely to happen at all. Homicide costs $1.2 million per case, not very likely. There are only 640 a year in the US today. Rape, if you're a hotel owner, you're going to pay a lot of money for rape, and a lot of women are going to pay a lot of pain for rape. Assault, medical expenses, lost work, suffering, pain, loss of function. Bullying, harassment, verbal abuse, mental anguish, lost productivity, turnover, people not wanting to work there, morale problems, kids not wanting to go to school, kids unable to focus in school. These are all costs. And when we've looked at this from the standpoint of a cold calculation of emotional and economic costs, we have no doubt that the lesser forms of violence are far more costly to human potential, human suffering, human dignity, and even dollars than the more serious things that capture all the attention. So recognizing that nothing starts with a threat and that these more common problems are actually more costly to humanity, we've pushed back the prevention effort so that what we're trying to prevent is all of the misconduct, not just that late stage we call a threat. To do that requires looking at things somewhat differently. Among the things that it requires looking at differently are how we teach everyone in the organization to identify signs of a troubled person, whether it's a student or an employee. Why should you go against the cultural norm, which teaches everyone not to be a tattletale, a snitch, or a rat? Why should you tell? And for each institution, the answer's a little different. It can be to help your coworker keep his job, because if it goes beyond this, he won't be able to keep his job. To help your friend stay in school, because if it gets worse, there's a risk of expulsion. To help your friend feel better and be less distressed or stay alive. These are all messages that need to be tailored to the audience, but it's the reason that it must be made a moral imperative, if not an obligation of being a member of that community, to report certain kinds of behavior to the appropriate people. Now, we've learned how to do this with no problems in corporations. They see where the costs lie, they get it instantly, they do it beautifully. Schools are another story. It has been one frustration after another in trying to roll out this approach in schools. The first effort that we made in a big way was in 2000, I was approached by one of the Hollywood studios who had the idea of a school violence prevention program sponsored by the studio. I spent a whole summer working on this. It was a coalition of the 7 major studios. They were going to devote stages, talent, everything you need for production. One of our clients was going to duplicate all of the videos. This was back in the VHS days. Another client, FedEx, was going to deliver it to every school in America, and this was going to be free to all the schools. We worked on the scripts. we were beginning to prepare this for rolling out to teachers, parents, students, and administrators, 4 different videos. At the end of the summer, I got a call from the head of this coalition saying, sorry, Park, we have to kill it. The FCC has just announced they're investigating Hollywood as the cause of school violence, so it'll look self-serving if we do it. Abort. That was the end of that one. So I thought, okay, we'll try this on our own. We can't afford to produce multi-million-dollar videos, but we will roll out training of the kind we do for corporations. We printed 10,000 brochures and sent them to 10,000 schools, offering a very low-cost way to achieve this. Didn't get a single phone call, not one. Next effort was, well, I won't go through a series of failed efforts. Finally, the state of Tennessee Department of Education had us do training for all the public schools in Tennessee. A few universities have adopted, in theory, the approach, but none of them ever wants to do the whole thing. They always want to do it themselves. They want to take something that was in development 7 years and went through 100 committees and make up something off the cuff they think is cuter or sexier or a better fit to their culture, rather than doing what's been tested and works. Universities repeatedly show themselves to think that everyone with a doctorate is an expert on everything. No matter that your doctorate's in art history, you're entitled to rewrite something that's been elaborately conceived and designed. We also find that the bureaucracies stand in the way. In universities, there is a perception of, there is a sense that fairness trumps safety. Whereas one of our operating principles is never allow your concern for social justice to override your concern for safety. Our motto is safety first, fairness second. That's very difficult in a university environment. A second problem arises from the fact that universities, being a medieval structure, allow it to happen that a group of talented, well-trained people who develop a solution to a problem can have their decision overridden by someone who doesn't have any of the facts or any of the training or any of the experience. We've seen disasters happen in universities because of this, because they don't allow their own team to have autonomy. Or an attorney who passes final judgment decides, no, we're not going to risk a wrongful termination suit. Every good attorney would rather face a wrongful termination suit than a wrongful death suit. And that's often the choice that's being made. In public schools, we see warring factions between teachers, the teachers' union, the administration, and the parents. And all of them are hamstrung by red tape of a kind that's unimaginable. Nobody who looked at how the public schools operate and what they have to do for any kind of sensible intervention would think that there was any sanity to the system. If they're going to make a decision about having a child who clearly needs help enter some kind of treatment program or get some special services, it takes a committee of 24 people who have to meet multiple times for hours and argue about it. It's as if the bureaucracy has caused people to lose their minds. It is unthinkable. And the war between the parents and the teachers stands in the way constantly of doing the right thing for the kids. They have been postured as enemies, and they make it very difficult for the children to be well cared for. When we did the psychiatric autopsy following the Columbine shootings, which we did for the DA's office there, and which was filmed by Bill Curtis and put on A&E under the title Columbine, Understanding Why. We came out with some ideas for students, or rather for parents. The ideas for parents included, if your child shows warning signs of violent behavior or drug abuse, talk to the child. Imagine how basic. If a child abuses a substance, possesses a weapon, or is picked up by the police, talk to the child and search the child's room. Those are probable cause for searching the child's room. Several of the most famous mass murders in schools could have been prevented by that particular activity. What would you do if you searched your child's room and found pipe bombs and handguns and plans for destroying the school? What would you do if you searched your child's room and found countless materials on mass murder and an utter fascination with the Columbine killers? Parents have a duty to pay attention to what their kids are doing and to search the child's room when they have probable cause. For schools, what really matters is a culture of mutual respect instead of the warring factions, devising the means or adopting the means to teach students, staff, and faculty what they need to report, to whom they need to report it, including bullying and harassment, not just late-stage threats. Making sure that every institution, whether it's a school district, a college, has a trained cross-functional team that knows how to handle dating violence, domestic violence, stalking, bullying, intimidation, harassment, and threats. And making sure they have people they can turn to, both for the emotional needs that arise for the team, because that's hard work, and people are affected by it, and also for guidance on creative solutions to some of the problems that arise. We've never seen a case that couldn't be solved in a way that everyone walked away safely. But to do it right means learning that the case needs solving. That's the reporting problem, and where many organizations fall down. Gathering the data and putting the right minds together to fix it. I'm very concerned that our secondary schools are not going to be able to achieve that adequately because they are constantly diverted to the wrong priority. If you just look at the recent incidents after Sandy Hook and even after Virginia Tech, the media pushed institutions everywhere to worry about emergency notification systems. That's a secondary preventive measure with no great right answer that costs a lot of money to implement technologically. That's a fine thing to do in year 5 of a rollout after you've accomplished the much more important tasks that will prevent things every single day. Another of these media-driven fads was active shooter training. Let's teach people that they have 3 options: run, hide, or fight. And there are 2 videos available for it. One's commercial, one's from the Houston Police Department. They both contain good information. The problem is that's a secondary intervention. That's very low priority. If you already have in place all the important things, sure, that's fine. But one school after another is making that their whole program. So all they'll know how to do is run, hide, or fight if it happens. They're doing nothing to keep it from happening. Or a third one that has been one of these media blitzes is getting a security audit of the school. where people walk around and look at how many doors there are and what kind of locks there are and how many exits, what are the escape routes. That's a standard part of any security planning. It's fine to have it, but that's got nothing to do with preventing violence in the institution. And yet schools all over America were sending out RFPs for these security audits after Sandy Hook, instead of doing the things that would actually keep students safer. It is massively frustrating to watch this. After Sandy Hook, the National Rifle Association did a big project. A highly publicized report came out recommending armed guards in schools and offering technical assistance to achieve that. They mentioned farther down on the first page, you might also want to consider calling TAG for a violence prevention program. This was massively publicized. We didn't get a single phone call out of it. Attention is drawn to the sexy topics: emergency notification, active shooter training, controversies over armed guards. Who cares about the kids? I don't see the evidence that anyone's paying attention to what would really help the kids. And that's a story of how I got to the point of being very frustrated by educational institutions. Thankfully, the corporate world still likes to do things the right way. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, is this mic going to come on? Oh, it's there? Okay. We have time for some questions here. Thank you very much, Park, for a fascinating talk and biography of how you got to where you are right now. I know we have a lot of questions. We'll start in the back here.
And thank you, Dr. for all your insight. So you spent a bit of time telling us what the media would have us do, which is not the right thing to do. And we got tertiary and secondary things. So could you give us like a little outline of what would be in primary prevention with respect to schools, for example?
Yes, actually, some of what I was alluding to is primary prevention. Step one is to make sure that the appropriate people form a team that gets fully trained. And the appropriate people for a secondary school district, a public school district, would include administrators at the district level, principals and assistant principals, who are going to need a certain level of training, but also HR, because there are employees who misbehave as well. So it's going to require that there be representation from their employment lawyer, their education lawyer, from human resources, from the district administration, and at least one principal sitting actively on the team to make decisions. Now, I believe in training all the principals and assistant principals and all the district level people as well. This decision level training, we think, requires 2.5 days to cover every topic that needs being covered. The next step is rolling out training to people at every school, and in an ideal world, it would include all of the teachers, all of the staff members, whose real role is that of recognizing their limitations. Here's what you report to our mental health resources or refer. Here's what you report to the team at the district level. Here's what you don't do. You do not go be an amateur detective. You do not ignore it. You do not play shrink. You report it. Your only job is to refer and report. Anything else you do is the wrong thing. Because left to their own devices, supervisors and managers, teachers and faculty ignore problem behavior until it gets intolerable, or overreact to it. And the ways they tend to overreact to it are ways that make things worse. So one way to make sure you have a lot of overreaction is pass a zero tolerance policy. In our first course in '93, we said, whatever you do, do not adopt a zero tolerance policy. This is stupid. I saw in the New York Times today, finally schools are rethinking it. But it produces nothing but trouble. I think I untracked myself there. But a second thing that tends to make matters worse is having uniformed police officers who don't know how to talk to normal or disturbed people show up and do what police officers typically are trained to do, which is not have regard for who's watching and be aggressive. So if we have uniformed police roll up on an employee who's in distress or a student who's in distress, who are going to behave aggressively and not be concerned with who's watching, it'll make matters worse. If you have people like UCLA police who are trained to do that and who are experienced with it, they'll handle it very professionally and not make matters worse. Another common error is getting a restraining order. Almost every circumstance where a restraining order can be obtained short of creditors is a bad idea. It's usually bad for the victim. It's always bad for the institution. That is typically an example of making one person's problem everyone's problem. So many institutions, to stand by their student or stand by their employee, will stand between the target victim and the bad guy. Well, what that does is add to the target victim list. There's always a better way to handle it that doesn't involve that harm. And that brings me to another of our operating principles, which is first, do no harm. Everyone in medicine knows this one. If we know of an intervention that might help and won't harm, we use it. If we know of an intervention that might harm, we never use it. We only do things that can only help. So they're very sexy things that are appealing to do that we never do, like lie to people. We never do it. If you lie to people, it will backfire. Even if we weren't ethically prohibited, we wouldn't do it because it doesn't work. We never prematurely send law enforcement. We never get restraining orders. We never have lawyers send nasty letters. Now, there's a time and a place in the world for all those things, but it isn't when managing the delicate tension of a potentially violent person in your institution. There's always a better way to manage them.
Thank you. Yes, we have a question. We have
I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about the unfolding of these violent acts in school and what the cause of it is, if it's increasing, and if there's some thoughts you have about preventing these acts by thinking on a cultural level of how we can reverse whatever might be going on. Since I think most of us, at least I remember when I was a kid, these things never happened. So what's going on and why can we do better?
So the question was about, for those of you who didn't hear it, about the causes of violent acts in school. Why are they increasing?
Well, let's first be sure we're talking about the same violent acts. I would divide them into mass murders, for which the promulgating factor is the media glamorizing them. And I've already addressed what to do about that. Second are shootings in schools. Ordinary shootings, not mass murders, but ordinary shootings. And the third is everything else, the bullying, the harassment, and so on. Now, the ordinary shootings are not happening in every neighborhood. The ordinary shootings are happening in minority neighborhoods with parental neglect and too many guns in the wrong hands. I don't think there's any question about that. They're happening in Chicago, which has the strictest gun laws in the country. They're happening primarily in places where there is massive social pathology, high gang activity, high drug use in the community. Those are the ills that have to be repaired if you want to prevent shootings in high schools of the normal kind. Now, the bullying, harassment, intimidation, and so on, those are normal aggressive behaviors of people with X chromosomes and some without. And the way to deal with that is to change the culture of the school and to work on promoting civility and having expectations that are enforced. You can only be a member of this community if you behave in certain ways. I haven't thought this one through for schools in particular because we haven't had a need for it, but for retailers, I've been promoting for years an orientation video that says, here's some expectations if you come to work for us. Here's some things that are okay to have in your purse: checkbook, driver's license, a pen, your keys, makeup. Here's some things that aren't okay to have in your purse: knife, gun, mace, drugs, alcohol. Because some of the people hired, like some of the students coming to school, have never been told. Nobody has said that that's not how you behave. We have to start with the basics of how do you act like a civilized human being. They don't know. No one's teaching them this at home. And the teachers are so frustrated by what walks into their schools and what they have to deal with, they don't want to hear it anymore. They want to put in their day and get the hell out of there because they're sick of these animals. That's how the teachers think of it. Now, I'm not saying all teachers are like this. There are obviously many dedicated teachers, but lots of teachers working with kids in poor neighborhoods are abused, they're threatened, they're disrespected constantly, nobody's paying attention to them, and they've totally lost patience, as anyone would after enough time in that environment. There's a system in need of massive repair.
I agree with that completely, and here's the problem, though. You get your friend Tommy in 1960, who probably wouldn't have cared if he couldn't go back to the classroom. He had a business going, and he was successful at what he was doing. And if his parents were neglecting him, then you have him continuing that way. And if they did know what he was doing but couldn't keep him in check, we don't have school psychologists who are able to give counseling to a child every single day. The parents may not be able to afford to take a child to therapy every day. That child then becomes the Columbine shooter years later. It seems like it's impossible to almost solve this problem.
Should I repeat it?
Please.
It seems nearly impossible to solve the problem when people like my childhood acquaintance, Tommy, who don't care about the consequences the school can give them, and are profiting from it in one way or another, carry on with impunity. And I think you're right that if we are limited to the kinds of consequences schools can offer, that there's a limit to what can be done for a psychopath, for example. And this goes into a whole other topic, that it is possible to recognize psychopaths by age 6. Nobody's willing to do it because of concerns for segregating them from other children. But the solutions for psychopaths for whom we have no treatment are going to be segregation from society, incarceration, or other extreme measures. I mean, everybody I know in law enforcement would privately agree that the best thing for the world would be to identify them at age 6 and put them down, because they are nothing but trouble. They will harm people their entire lives, and this group of 2 to 3% of men cause 80% of the violent crime. They are completely exploitive, parasitic, horrible beasts. And yet, because we afford everyone equal rights, and because we don't treat minors as adults until they kill someone, we're very limited in what can be done while they remain juveniles. But kids like Tommy belong in juvenile hall, not in a school with other kids.
Yeah, I was a
Ah,
So this,
yeah.
resonates with me.
All right.
Yes, there.
Your last comment regarding psychopaths raises an interesting question, and let me try and focus it toward the university context. Many universities actually do have systems where they attempt to identify, share information, and to identify problematic students, problematic in the sense of potentials for suicide, problematic in the sense of deeply disturbed individuals who may be at risk for violence to others. They gather the information. They do it in what they call threat assessment teams on a number of the campuses. And I know about this because I was a legal consultant to the university over 3 years on some of these issues. The problem, though, becomes, what do you do about those problematic individuals that you identify? If they are psychopaths, is the best that you can do just to remove them from the university context and perhaps move the problem elsewhere?
Generally, the best one can do for a psychopath within a university is to offer them positive incentives to behave as you want them to behave. They are responsive to rewards. Or find a means to cause them to want to leave. And there's usually a way to cause people to want to leave.
My experience was that if the problematic individual violated a rule, then that was used as a lever for discipline to invite them to leave or to be subjected to consequences that come from violating the rule.
Yeah, and that's fine. Some are responsive to that, but most will look, a serious psychopath is going to look for a way around that or a way to retaliate. If you've cost him money, if you've caused him inconvenience, if you've caused him to lose face, why shouldn't he get even with you? So we tend to look for ways for the more dangerous ones to incentivize them to get out of our environment.
One follow-up question to that, Park, is not so much the psychopath, but the severely mentally ill individual, somebody like Loeffner in Colorado. We were talking about earlier today. The mental health system is in tatters. And in almost all jurisdictions, people who are severely mentally ill have a constitutional right to be mentally ill and refuse treatment. Yet, and the serious violent acts by these individuals, as you pointed out, they're not that common, but they're horrible, tragic when they occur. Thoughts on how we try to rein that in?
Yes, I don't think we're going to see adequate mental health resources in the public sector anytime soon. In the meantime, what I think we have to do when there are seriously psychotic students, staff, teacher, who are not volunteering for treatment, who don't take gentle persuasion to enter into treatment, and that's many of those without insight. We have to have a frank conversation with the person and explain to them which behaviors are frightening other people, which behaviors are interfering with the orderly functioning of the institution, and how we welcome them as a member of the community, attending classes, earning a degree, if they stop behaving that way, and we'll even help them get treatment that will help them stop behaving that way. We'll orchestrate it, we'll find the right person, Sometimes we'll pay for it. But if they want to remain that way and behave that way, breaking those rules, they can't be part of this institution. If they'd like to go to a different institution that doesn't have those rules, that's fine. We'll even refund their tuition for the semester, but they can't be here. In fact, they can't even be on the campus, so there's going to be a trespass notice. They'll be arrested if they come back. But it's up to them. Do they want to stop behaving in a way that breaks the rules and stay here or return? Or do they want to leave and not come back? Which do you want? We always put it as a choice when we can.
And that would be a circumstance where you would get some kind of legal sanction for somebody coming. You're talking about not getting restraining orders.
Yeah, we don't get restraining orders. We get what's called a trespass notice, which has all of the upside and none of the downside.
Good, thank you. Yes, up here.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Dietz, for coming to speak with us today. So my question, as someone who is interested in eventually going into medical school and hopefully into psychiatry, how do you think that any mental professional, whether it's a therapist or a social worker or a psychiatrist, how can they help this problem by being active preventers and not so much like passive participants who kind of just wait for patients to come to them, or basically they're at the end point where, you know, these people obviously are in need of some help and support, but because it just seems like usually people nowadays, they kind of come when the situation is really bad, but not so much when they kind of see the early signs and are trying to prevent it from becoming something worse.
Well, you know, I don't, for the most part, see it as a mental health issue for clinicians. I do think clinicians can play a part in a totally different role as prevention agents through educational activities and consultation to organizations. But in treating individual patients, the best you can do is manage the patient well and try to keep them hooked in and motivated to stay in treatment.
So do you think it's only on an individual level and not so much on a broader scale that professionals can really help with the problem?
Well, I think in the clinical role, you can only help one person at a time. But but a clinician can also have another role doing prevention through community education, organizational education, consultation, research into what's effective and what isn't. All of these are preventive roles a clinician can play.
I know there are a lot more questions here, and I wish we could keep going, but we do need to draw the evening to a close. First,
On behalf of the Friends of the Semel Institute, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's open mind presentation on preventing violence in our educational institutions. We are very honored to have with us this evening Dr. Park Dietz, who is one of the country's foremost experts in forensic psychiatry, and has testified or consulted on almost every major criminal case in our recent history. Dr. Dietz is a MD, Master's in Public Health, and a PhD, which is quite an amazing credential, and we are very fortunate that he is here to speak with us this evening. So thank you, Dr. Dietz. And also with us this evening is Dr. Andrew Luchter, who is a professor of psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences here at UCLA. And he's also our faculty advisor, but he also was Dr. Dietz's former student. And Dr. Dietz has said that Dr. Luchter was the smartest student he ever had. So, Dr. Luchter, former student, will be introducing Dr. Dietz. And we're very fortunate and thank Dr. Luchter for being here with us this evening. I know that many of you have been with us before, but for those of you who are here for the first time, I just want to briefly tell you about the Semel Institute and the Friends. We are a volunteer organization. We support the Semel Institute, which is one of the premier centers for the study of the mind, brain, and behavior in the world, with a faculty of over...
Recommended to me that rather than showing you PowerPoint all evening, that it could be of some interest to you if I were to actually talk to you. And I'm going to do that in a way that's not familiar to me particularly. I'm going to speak somewhat biographically about how I came to this and go from that to what I've learned in the course of it. Because what I get asked often is, how did I start all of this? And I'm going to tell you about that frankly. In 1960, when I was 12 years old, I met a boy named Tommy who ran a band. Now, Tommy was a kind of interesting, fascinating character for a 12-year-old. I became the drummer for the band. He was the first guy to sell switchblades in town. He was the first kid to have pornography and show it and sell it. He was the first kid to figure out how you steal beer off back porches and sell it to the other kids. And he was the coolest kid around the playground. He was a few years older. He got expelled from that school and many others. And I lost touch with him, was not allowed to play in the band anymore after the police told my parents he was running a prostitution ring. And I thought he was interviewing female vocalists. What did I know? And I lost touch with Tommy for 3 years, and I came back from a trip somewhere away and was speaking to a girl that I dated briefly.
Is one of the world's foremost experts on the criminal mind. Park went on from being on the faculty at Harvard to being on the faculty at UVA, where he was the director of the University of Virginia Center for Psychiatry and the Law. From there, he actually moved out here and became a member of our clinical faculty and founded his own forensic practice, as well as Threat Assessment Group, which is an entity which is really focused on assessing threats and preventing violence in all sorts of settings, including in educational institutions. And I'm really thrilled that Park is here to speak with us about his work tonight. His list of accomplishments goes on and on. He is the former president of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law, one of the foremost forensic psychiatry organizations in the country. He's a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, has been a consultant to the FBI and to law enforcement in all 50 states, and has been involved in virtually every high-profile violent crime case, multiple murder case in the country in the latter part of the 20th century, including the Unabomber case, John Hinckley, Jeffrey Dahmer, the DC sniper, sort of the list goes on and on. And of course, his premier academic credential is he's a consultant to Law and Order. Which of course, there are so many shows, I'm surprised that doesn't take all of his time. So without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce to you my friend and mentor, Dr. Park Dietz.
Thank you, Andy, for that very warm introduction. I'm going to try something unusual tonight. It's been recommended.
400 clinicians and researchers who work collaboratively to develop new treatments for illnesses of the mind and brain. And the Friends focus our work in two areas, one being education, and we produce The Open Mind, the series which you're here for this evening. We bring renowned speakers to UCLA and present programs with preeminent professors of psychiatry from the Semel Institute, researchers from the Semel Institute about illnesses of the mind and brain and current research being done on them. We also believe very strongly in supporting the next generation of young scientists through our Friends Scholar Program and our Friends Travel Grant Program. Each year we award scholarships to brilliant young faculty, junior faculty or fellows to start their research. And this year we're very fortunate. One of our scholars, Erin Kelly, is doing work in community, in helping helping homeless people better have better access to services for both mental and physical disorders. And Dr. Kelly is here with us this evening. Because of the generosity of our donors, we are able to fund 3 young scholars this year, and we are able to continue to bring you these incredible open mind programs that we hope that you will continue to attend and hopefully will support. And I see another one of our scholars coming in right now, Dr. Tara Paris. She is studying anxiety disorders in young people. So welcome, and thank you all for coming this evening. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Lupter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vicki. So I was a third-year medical student, and I really wanted to understand something more about criminal behavior and thought that a career in forensic psychiatry might be very interesting. So I started, this was pre-Google, of course, so just started reading in terms of, who was the world's foremost expert on criminal behavior and who were the rising stars in this field. And of course, one of the names that came up was Dr. Park Dietz, who at that point was on the faculty at Harvard. So I arranged to go do an elective with Park. My first assignment there was to go to the Bridgewater State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, where I sat down across from this man. I wanted to get to know him, and I said, so, what brings you here? And he starts with this torrent of expletives about how he had to be the one to kill Jimmy Carter because Jimmy Carter had been seeing one of his 30 wives and had been using radio waves to control his brain. And I said, can you excuse me just 1 second? And that's when I went and got Park. I think it is no exaggeration to say that I learned more about how to deal with deeply disturbed, frequently psychotic individuals from Park than I have from anybody else. He has seen and dealt with some extraordinarily disturbed individuals, many of whom are unfortunately involved in very violent or criminal acts. And I think it's no exaggeration to say that he is